All right, everyone, it's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. I'd like to welcome you to the final session in our HITRUST webinar series. Today we're going to discuss the HITRUST maturity model, the assessment process, report options, some timelines, and strategies for maintaining your HITRUST compliance. So just to go over a couple of things before we dive into our discussion today. All attendees will be entered in a drawing to win a $25 Amazon gift card. The winner will be notified through email tomorrow. We also want to mention to you that all attendees will be muted throughout the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature. I know Jesse loves questions, so please send those in and we will monitor those throughout the hour. This session is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides following the presentation, so you can look for those in your inbox tomorrow. And just a little bit of background about who we are before we get started. Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI QSA, a licensed CPA firm, and now an approved HITRUST CSF assessor, providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 11 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 1, SOC 2, PCI, FISMA, HITRUST, and ISO 27001 and 27002. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars, and kind of a new feature, we have started having free video resources, and we actually have a new series dedicated to HITRUST. So go look for our free HITRUST videos online and connect with us on social as well. So now I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, Jesse Skibby.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I will introduce myself for those of you that may be joining us for the very first time. I have over 20 years, holy cow, I'm old. Over 20 years of experience in information technology security and across a multitude of different industries. I guess the most important thing to know about me is I was the one responding to audits and the information security professional on the other side of the audit table for the majority of my career. And now I'm really being able to educate and, empower and inspire our clients to achieve those greater levels of assurance. I mean, that's really what we're working towards doing, and being on this side of things. Helping our clients through the audit process is something I very much enjoy doing. Certifications, of course, important to me. As you can see, various certifications through regulatory compliance areas, and of course, most notable for this session, I am a HITRUST CSF practitioner. So we can move on. So the general legal disclaimer that we must show you through all of our webinars. This presentation is provided by Kirkpatrick Price for educational and/or informational purposes only. It's not meant to be legal advice. You need to have a relationship with your own attorney to get legal advice. So that is our legal disclaimer. All right, so I wanted to give you a quick recap of session one, and I guess before I even get to that, the intent for these webinars that we put together was really because we had a lot of people calling in and really, hearing about HITRUST or in a panic because they just received a letter that said they had to be HITRUST certified by a certain date, and just a lot of explaining that we were doing on a pretty regular basis. And I wanted to put this together. Like I said, I used to be on the other side of the audit table. I used to have those client demands, and I understand what it's like to be really just starting at square one. I know I need something. How do I go out and get it? So we put these series of webinars together really focused on the business associate. So you're working for someone that's a covered entity, or you're wanting to get clients in the healthcare market, and you know that having a HITRUST certification would really help you achieve those clients or gain some new prospects. So what we really wanted to do is put together just a really basic, here's how I get started. So we started that with session 1, and if you missed that, that's available on our website to download and listen to. But what we wanted to do in that session was really talk to you about who is the HITRUST Alliance. So the HITRUST Alliance is a not-for-profit organization that just celebrated their 10-year anniversary. You know, basically talking you through who are they, what is their intention, and what are they doing, you know, to increase controls and to assist the healthcare market. So it's good to know about some of their initiatives, you know, and working with the federal government and really trying to respond to the needs in the industry right now with healthcare and data protection. So we talked about that in session 1. Who is it? What is the Common Security Framework? That's the CSF. That is the core of, you know, what HITRUST works on and what HITRUST Alliance has obviously built. We talked about the fact that it's built on ISO, but encompassing other areas such as PCI, NIST, all other types of frameworks. It's really nothing new, in my opinion. It's really just gathering up what has worked in well-known frameworks, and it's combined to make the Common Security Framework. So we also talked about a 5-step process of getting started. And I'm not going to go through all these because obviously you can go through and listen to session 1, but really just to kind of bring you up to speed on where we've been, what the intention is for this series, and how we're now getting to this 3rd session. So in session 2, we talked about scoping the environment because the HITRUST certification assessment, the validated assessment, is very scope-driven. In fact, it's going to be on the very first page of your certification report, is exactly what the scoped environment is. So understanding what your scope is, what's in scope, what's out of scope, how do you navigate that, that's really what we talked about in session 2. So, and part of that, understanding how to scope that, is knowing what your risk factors are related to your organization. So two documents that I added to this that I really think help you understand and navigate how to scope, and that is the assessment methodology and the assurance program requirements. So step 1, with understanding how the CSF, how the certification program works and what HITRUST has to offer, definitely going to, and you'll get this when you get the email with the downloadable presentation, you'll be able to click on these links and go to the HITRUST Alliance website and get the assurance program requirements, which really just talk you through the different levels of assessment, the self-assessment, the validated assessment, who is authorized to do the assessment, things like that, just some core information. And I thought that would be a really good document to share. If you have members of your management team, they're just not sure what HITRUST is, that assurance program requirements document is really filled with a lot of great information to share with those that really just want a high-level view of the program itself. And then the other must-have resources that I wanted you to have was the assessment methodology. Now that one kind of talks you through the scoping criteria. So if you're not sure, you know, which category you fall into, you're not sure what a quote-unquote record means, those types of things are defined within that the assessment methodology document. So I really wanted you to have that because we talked about in session 2 how important scoping the environment is, how the HITRUST CSF is scalable, how to navigate through the various levels, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in today's session. And I wanted you to have these documents to get started. You can go ahead. All right, so as Jenna mentioned earlier, today's agenda, we're going to talk in detail about maturity model control scoring. This is how a HITRUST will determine whether or not you qualify to be certified. So based on your level of maturity and your scoring, that's really going to determine whether or not you achieve certification. So it's really, really important to understand how that works and how, when you're navigating the controls, you'll be able to determine whether you're going to meet that score goal or not. So then we're going to go through the assessment process. We're going to talk about the different report options and some timeline projections. That's usually lesson number 1 when someone calls in a panic and they have to be certified by a certain time frame. It's good to know right out of the gate the average amount of time it takes to get through an assessment, so you can be empowered with that knowledge and you can have a discussion with your client and your internal management. And then we're going to talk about, you know, going forward, your strategy for maintaining compliance. We're going to talk about the decertification potential and how long certification lasts and all those details. So as Jenna mentioned, I absolutely love questions. So if you have questions, I would absolutely love to see those in the chat box. And actually, we have a question right now. Will I have the ability to access session 1 and 2? Yes, those are all available on our website. If you go to kirkpatrickprice.com, there is a link to download the previously recorded webinars. Also, there is a series of 6 videos. I know Jenna mentioned it briefly, but I did a series of 6 YouTube videos for kind of breaking down these 3 topics into a little bit of a different format. So definitely check those out as well, because they are jam-packed with even more details to help get you started. So you can go on to the next slide. All right, now this slide has a lot of detail, so I don't want to overwhelm you with reading all of this, but definitely wanting you to understand these 5 different areas that you will be scored for maturity. Those of you that may be familiar with the NIST, Program Review for Information Security Management Assistance, this is HITRUST version of that. So if you want to gain some further knowledge on this PRISMA model, you can definitely check out the NIST website and really just searching for information based on PRISMA will give you even more detail if you're having trouble kind of navigating this. But let me try to make this simple versus complicated. So there's 5 different subject areas that every single control will be evaluated based upon. And of course, a lot of this makes perfect sense. You know, do you have it documented within a policy? Is it documented within a procedure? So processes are necessary to ensure the control can be implemented in a repeatable and consistent way. So procedures, to me, they always assign responsibility to give a deeper level of knowledge to the actual person implementing it than the policy. So procedures take it one step further. And then, of course, we look at, is it documented, is it communicated, is it implemented? So evaluating the control implementation across the depth of the organization. Now, really, what's really important here is it communicated? Depending on what it is. Obviously, if it's a technical control, we're going to check for implementation and we're going to validate that implementation. But a lot of times, things need to be communicated that are not necessarily a technical control. It may be administrative control. So one of the ways that we test the implementation on that is obviously interviewing with the person responsible. So think about carrying this all the way through. So you have a control, let's say, for example, logical access. You have a logical access control policy, you have procedures for maintaining that access, and then you have the ability to test whether or not that's actually been implemented. Is it operational? Is it actually working? So, and then we get into measured and managed, which are 2 areas that even HITRUST recognizes that not every company is going to be at this level of maturity. So if you think about 75% of your overall score is made up of policy, procedure, and implemented, then you can focus, you can laser focus on making sure that those 3 areas are covered. A lot of companies are not going to be at the measured and managed level yet, and HITRUST recognizes that. And in fact, you can achieve certification without that. They want you to work towards that. They want to push you into measuring and managing, but to gain certification out of the gate, you do not have to have everything in place as far as measure and manage. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in greater detail, but I do want to kind of mention that because most companies are not there. And a lot of way to describe measured would be some sort of a statistical analysis to be able to measure the effectiveness of that control. The greatest example that I can give of measured, and an easy way to understand this is, say, for example, your antivirus controls. Your control, you have it written in a policy that you will have antivirus implemented. You have procedures that require updating of the latest signatures. And then maybe you have obviously proof of implementation because the antivirus software is up to date on all the computers tested. And then you have a measured control. So a measured control may be your antivirus console that says, we have 100 computers and 98% of them are effectively up to date with their antivirus. That's a classic way of measuring because you're looking at some statistical analysis saying, okay, I know that this is my policy, I know I have a procedure, I know it's implemented, and now here is some analysis on your overall compliance. So now that you have a measurement, you can actually manage to that. So you really can't manage unless you have measurements. So there's some ways of doing that ad hoc, but primarily the way I want to explain this is managed works on what your measurement is. So if you say, okay, I've got 98% of my computers that are protected, now what am I going to do to implement to make sure that those last 2% are actually caught up to date? So you can effectively manage it from a higher level when you know what the measurements are. So just to make things a little more confusing, let's go to the next slide. It's a lot of data, and hopefully you can see it large enough on your screen. This will be really helpful when you get the download of this presentation. But this is kind of some of the background on how these are scored. Now, when you're using the MyCSF tool, if you're going through a self-assessment or if you're going through a validated assessment, these calculations are going on in the background. You are responding to a particular control, and you're answering questions such as, I have this somewhat implemented, I have the majority of this implemented, or I have none of this implemented. So you're going to read a requirement statement, you're going to select an answer, and what's happening kind of behind the scenes is what I'm showing you here. So if you're just looking at the CSF and you're reading the control requirements and you're trying to determine, what am I missing? Am I going to qualify for certification? This is what I want to really get your mindset focused on, because if you are evaluating every single control across those 5 maturity model scores, and then you're also looking at, okay, I have a policy, but does my policy sufficiently cover all of the implementation requirements at this control? So you know that policy, procedure, and implemented make up 75%. They make up the lion's share of the control itself, of the score. But then there's also a deeper level going, from top to bottom on each of those 5 areas. So for example, does your policy contain none of the CSF requirements? You would get nothing, you would get no score for that. You get 25% of that score if it contains some of the CMS requirements, or even ad hoc. There's a lot of categories that actually allow you to have an ad hoc or an informal mechanism in place, as long as it can be tested and as long as the implementation can be tested. And a lot of times an ad hoc method will qualify. So then, for example, policy contains all CSF requirements, and sorry, this is so tiny, I can barely see this. So you get the picture. So you're going into each of these areas and you're looking at, does the policy that you have in place, does the procedure that you have either informally or communicated, or the implementation, does it meet none of the requirements listed? Does it meet some of them? Does it meet all of them? So you're going across the top, policy, procedure, implemented, measured, managed, but you're also going from top to bottom in each of those 5 areas, measuring how much of a score can you achieve based on how, the percentage of the implementation requirements that you have in place. And I'm going to describe this a little bit further in the next couple of slides. So don't panic if this doesn't make sense to you quite yet. So let's go on to the next slide. Because I do want to kind of give you another, again, this is very, very small and hard to read. But in order to achieve certification, you must have a 3+ average score across all 19 assessment domains, or a 3+ a cap. So we're going to talk about corrective action plans a little bit here as well. So this is happening behind the scenes, like I said, when you're answering and you're responding to the questions within the MyCSF portal, when you're going through a validated assessment. So I don't want you to think that you have to be running these calculations in your head, but when you're going through a gap analysis, when you're going through your readiness phases and your implementation phases, you really have to think about what the control is and how is it going to be scored. And really I think the one thing I really like about the way the CSF is organized is it does put the requirements in black and white. You are given the implementation requirements that you need to have in place. Many times the implementation requirement will say very specifically that HITRUST CSF must be considered, and in your policy and procedure, they'll give you some very definitive, very black and white, set of instructions that you have to have in your policy. So when you're looking at your own controls and you're doing your self-evaluation and your readiness, I want you to be thinking about this. Am I going to qualify according to what I know the scoring model is? Now, a lot of times they give you the ability to enter in a corrective action plan on the control level. So if you're meeting up to a level 3, so you have most of them in place, and they can be tested in policy, procedure, implemented, you're very, very close to meeting a 3+ or qualifying for certification in that area. Having a corrective action plan, having the deadlines based on the risk associated with the control is still going to qualify you for certification. So there is a way for you to be partially compliant and having, like I said, that corrective action plan in place. But your goal going into this should really be to be 100% compliant in policy, procedure, and implemented, because those 3 areas on their own make up 75% of the overall score. So that's really where the weight is. So having measured and managed in various areas, it's very, very powerful as well. But like I said, really focusing in on the basic requirements, and that's policy, procedure, and implemented. So we do have a question of what defines the cap. Well, when you're working in the MyCSF tool and you're not meeting the 3+, if you're not getting over that level 3 threshold, it's going to prompt you to enter in a cap. We're actually going to talk about corrective action plans a little bit more, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But a cap must be in place for that control if you're not meeting a 3+ or greater. So it's going to require you to enter in a cap for all those items. All right, let's go on to the next, because I wanted to kind of give you a real-world scenario of what this could look like for you based on an actual control. So what you're looking at here is basically, and if you want to follow along, it's on page 266 of version 8.1 of the CSF. So if you have that and you want to follow along, or just at least know where this comes from so you can look at it further, this is an example for you. Also, across the top, you see control category 7, asset management. There are 14 control categories within the CSF. So asset management is one of those 14 in the CSF requirements. And then you have objective name, which is 0702 information classification. There are 46 of those objective name of that level within the CSF. So this particular item that we're looking at is information classification 07.02. So the control objective is to ensure that information receives an appropriate and consistent level of protection. So classification guidelines, information shall be classified in terms of its value, legal requirements, sensitivity, and critical to the organization. So now we understand kind of the intent of the control. So let's go to the next slide. So, and in my example here, I wanted to show you, let me see here, trying to use 2 screens. So in this particular control, the level 1 implementation requirements, now this is what I was talking to you about earlier. This implementation requirement that you're scoring yourself on is organizations processing PHI shall uniformly classify such data as confidential, which means there are limitations to its disclosure within the organization and externally. So that is a requirement statement that you would need to score yourself on. So do you have this documented within a policy? Is there a procedure that defines, classifying data? Is it implemented? Do you actually classify data according to your policy and procedure? Is there potentially a measurement in place to ensure this control is functioning? A lot of times that could mean maybe there's an internal audit that's performed against this particular control, and you're measuring it for some sort of a statistical analysis for effectiveness. Every time I test it, it's 100% effective. So there's your 100% score. So anyway, not to get too far off track, but so you're looking at this requirement statement here, and you are evaluating your compliance in all 5 of those maturity model scores. So I also have listed here the level 2 organizational factors. Now this kind of goes back to our level conversation that we had in session 2. But I wanted to give you an example. Let's say, for example, I am an IT service provider, and I'm storing maybe 35 million records in my database. So that's going to say to me that I need to implement level 1. I also need to go and look at level 2 requirements, which are on the next slide. because I need to score myself not only with level 1 implementation, but I also need to score myself with level 2. So can you go to the next slide, Jenna? All right, so this is a lot of words, and I am not going to read all this, but what I wanted to really just drive home here is that based on your scoped environment, you've now moved into scoring yourself with not only the level 1 implementation requirements, but all of these level 2. So each one of these are requirement statements that you have to consider. So do you have a policy that contains this information? Is it communicated with the people that need to know? Can it be tested for implementation? Is there some sort of a measurement or a way to measure effectiveness of this control? And if there is that managed? So this is how you are following along with the controls as they're listed in the CSF, and you're looking at every single one in these 5 different subject areas, and you're scoring yourself. Do I have all of it implemented? Do I have none of it implemented? Do I have some of it? Is there an ad hoc or an informal method of meeting this control that can be explained and can be tested? So you're thinking through this as you're navigating the CSF. So you can go on to the next slide. All right, so this again is just continuing from the level 2 from the previous slide. This is, wait, I think you need to go to the next one. Yeah, this is just more along the lines of what I was just saying. So I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jenna. All right. So now we're going to move in. So we've talked about scoring. I hope that makes some sense. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to see them in the chat or see them in the chat box, or feel free to contact me afterwards. Again, it's a mindset that I really want you to gather, because I want you to think about that as you're reading through the controls. I want you to think about how you're going to score yourself, because when you go through the validated assessment, the assessor is going to go in and validate how they're going to either agree or disagree with how you have rated yourself. So you need to understand how the maturity model works so that you can rate yourself within the tool, and then someone obviously comes behind you in the assessment phase and they ask you for evidence and they validate that what you are saying is in place is really in place. But it starts with you. It starts with you having an understanding of your own maturity level score. Not that you're going to have to calculate that score yourself, but just understanding how the score is developed is really what my intention of describing it was today. So let's just talk through the assessment process, because that would be the next stage. So after you've gone through, you understand the controls, you've worked on your implementation, you've drafted policies and procedures, which is typically, when we go through the gap analysis process, one of the top findings coming out of that is documentation. So as you can tell, with every single one of the controls within the CSF, there is a policy requirement. So if your policies are in a weak standpoint, that's going to be an issue when you're going into the assessment phase, because the policies are very critical. And there's a reason why. Obviously, policies and procedures are what's used to communicate with employees. So if it's not written down, in a lot of cases, people don't think you're doing it. If it's not written down, you're not doing it. Or if it's not being effectively communicated, you really have no true way of ensuring that people are following your direction. So policy is a big deal. And it's, like I said, one of the most common findings coming out of the gap analysis that we do. So whether you're going through a self-assessment on your own using the MyCSF tool, or if you hire an assessment firm, such as Kirkpatrick Price, to kind of walk you through and and educate you on the process and walk you through identifying where your gaps are, then coming out of that typically is a policy and procedure project that may take you a couple of months, maybe take you 6 months to remediate. So it really does depend on where you're at now and where you need to go. So yeah, like I said, strongly recommending working with an approved HITRUST CSF assessment firm to perform the self-assessment, or it's a guided self-assessment, whether or not you're using the tool or whether you just hire us to do a gap analysis or another assessment firm, for example. You doing that first is definitely recommended. I can't imagine going into one of these assessments without doing a gap analysis, because there is so much as we just talked through an example of the control, there's so much finite detail. There's so much of an education process on the scoping exercise and applying that scope and the levels where appropriate. And so there's really a lot to understand and a lot of knowledge that you need to gain before going into the assessment. So this is a strong, high recommendation that you perform some type of a self-assessment first. Whether you have a robust internal audit department that you feel confident, or whether you hire someone, you need to do that. And then obviously taking time to remediate the gaps and then communicating the timeline with your assessor. Like I said, we get lots of calls, and sometimes people are in a panic because they need these assessments done very, very fast to meet a client requirement. And it's a really difficult position to be in because it just takes time. These things take time, to really implement them correctly. So understanding the timeline and not taking this lightly, obviously, because it is a very detailed process, is something you need to communicate with your assessment firm. Can you meet the deadlines? The other thing to consider is when you're signing up with HITRUST to do the validated assessment, unless you have a subscription, you're most likely going to have only a 90-day window to complete the assessment. So once you start the assessment, you only have 90 days to finish that. The assessor has to have all of their work also completed in that 90 days. So there are definitely some timelines to consider when you're navigating and going into the assessment phase. So you can go on to the next slide. All right, let me try to explain this very colorful timeline to you. So my goal with this was to kind of give you a ballpark of why does it take 4.5 months, or why does it take this long to get through an assessment? So let me see if I can describe this to you. So across the top, you kind of have who is responsible for the task. So that gray bar across the top indicates, basically who's running, who has the ball. The ball is in the client's court, or the ball is in the assessor's court. Like, who is required, whose time, what is the time constraint? Is it on me, or is it on the client? And then the second line there is what. So that's what's going on during that time frame. And then down below this, the second gray line there is when, and then how long at the very bottom. So that's kind of how this is structured. So starting with, this is a SOC 2 Plus, by the way. I wanted to give you two different options. So when, we talked quite a bit about report options in the last session. So if you decide to do what we're calling a SOC 2 Plus, which is where you get a SOC 2 report performed using the HITRUST CSF framework. And in that case, a CPA firm is attesting to the fact that you are compliant with HITRUST. It is not HITRUST certification unless you add HITRUST certification to that SOC 2 report. So this is just an example of, okay, I've decided I want to adopt HITRUST. I want to adopt it within my SOC 2. So in this case, for example, your clients would not be requesting certification. You just would like to adopt the framework, and you'd like to have it drafted within your SOC 2. So this is an example of that timeline. So I guess you're starting out with the scoping phase, because in the same, even if it's included in your SOC 2, the same rules apply. The maturity model scoring, the levels of implementation, all of that still applies, even when you're just performing it within your SOC 2. So the scoping is the first step. So in that particular segment of time, the client would walk through and determine what their scope is. So moving on from there, the client would go through a self-assessment. Now, in a lot of cases, there may be an assessor involved in the self-assessment, but we're saying that takes about 60 days. So I'm going all the way down to the bottom, showing you the self-assessment would take 60 days after a 5-day scoping situation. And then moving on from there, you're talking about potentially up to 90 days of remediation. So giving yourself 90 days, if not more, depending on the size of your organization and the gaps. This is obviously a moving scale, but 90 days is really depending on how long would it take you to remediate any gaps that were found. And then once the gaps are remediated, you would contact an assessor firm, or in this case, a CPA firm, because you're having a SOC 2 performed. And you're having what we call a planning call. This is the first call to say, what are your deadlines? What are your objectives? Let's all get on the same page with a project plan. That all happens during a planning call. So let's just say That takes about 2 weeks. Just realistically, it takes a few days to get on everyone's schedule. Now, that obviously can be condensed based on availability, but I'm just giving you kind of a somewhat realistic time frame. So then in our process, we begin with a remote review. So we collect documentation, we ask a lot of questions. In our case, we use an online audit manager portal to gather information from you, have discussions, really try to gather as much evidence as we possibly can prior to an on-site. So now we're moving into the third to the last column there, and that is the on-site assessment. That typically takes about 3 to 5 days, depending on the scoped environment. A smaller company may take, 2.5 to 3 days. A larger company, depending on the number of locations we would have to visit, really could vary, but trying to give you just a ballpark of 3 days for an on-site. And then we would take the assessment firm, or the CPA firm in this case, would take about 30 days to draft the report. So, once all of the evidence has been collected, once all the testing has been done, all of that is drafted into a very lengthy report. The SOC 2 Plus, including the HITRUST, those can be anywhere from 300 to 500 pages in length. So it incredibly increases the size of your SOC 2 report because of all the implementation requirements and the maturity model scoring, everything that must be included in there. They're quite lengthy reports. So then you have about a 2-week period to go over that report, review that report with your assessment or your audit firm. So we're estimating about 14 days. So in this situation, it's taken us, because we had to do a few months of remediation here, it's taken us about 8 months to get through this process. So this includes gap analysis, remediation, and the audit, giving yourself, I would say, realistically between 6 and 9 months to get there, really depending on your state of readiness, going into the project. So now we can go look at another example. So this is an example if you're just, I say just, but if you are trying to achieve certification. So in this subject line, we're going to perform a validated assessment. So we're going to be using the MyCSF portal to do this. So in this case, we're starting in January timeframe. We're scoping the engagement. Again, it's around a 5-day exercise. And then we're going into a self-assessment process. So this is a self-assessment using the MyCSF tool that you're doing on your own, which is a valid option. A guided self-assessment where you have an assessment firm that is working with you step by step through that process and helping you identify gaps. That's your best option. If you do not understand the CSF and maybe you don't have all the internal resources to spend the time investigating it and becoming an expert, you may want to involve an assessment firm at that point in time to come in and help with that self-assessment phase. But we're saying about 60 days in that gap analysis, that self-assessment, whatever you want to call it, really just taking a couple of months to get through that process. And then, again, we're going into 90 days of remediation, depending on what policies, procedures, additional administrative or technical controls that need to be implemented, giving yourself the allotted time to do that. And these are just kind of based on averages of what we've seen our clients go through. And then, of course, once you're ready, you've done your remediation, you're ready to go, then you start by contacting your assessment firm. Now, this has to be one of the approved assessment firms through HITRUST. So, example, Kirkpatrick Price, you contact us and you say, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to start my validated assessment. Now, this is important to have this planning call first, because you need to make sure that your assessment firm can meet the deadlines that you need to achieve. Because remember, once you sign up for the MyCSF portal, you tell HITRUST, I want to achieve certification, I want to begin a validated assessment. You have 90 days from the day that you sign up to actually complete the assessment, and that includes having your assessor complete all of their work. So it really needs to be a timeline that you work together with your assessment firm and you coordinate carefully, because they have to be able to meet your objectives on your timeline. So have that planning call first. And then what we typically do is, okay, client, now go and sign up for the CSF tool. Let's get that assessment object created. Let's start walking through your scoping exercise. In many cases, we will jump in and we will help set up that we will talk you through how to set that assessment object up and how to get started. So then we start with a remote review again. So we've got about 42 days, I would say, because we have to work within this 90. So we're taking not just a little over, I'm sorry, not quite half, to go through and do the remote, collection of data. So during that time, there are 19 assessment domains within the CSF tool. So we're going through, we're starting with domain 1, we're completing domain 1. The client is then completing that and sending that over to the assessor saying, I'm finished with this, now go and do your validation, your evaluation of the controls. So we're kind of working together in tandem along those lines until all 19 assessment domains have been responded to. And then we're looking at performing the on-site assessment. So again, that's 3 to 5 days, really depending on the size of the organization, the number of locations. So we're completing that, and then we're going into sending that information to HITRUST. So at the end, by that 90 days, now this can be completed sooner than 90 days, as long as you can get if your assessor firm agrees to a shortened timeline, that is definitely a possibility. You have up to 90, but you don't have to take all 90. So if you have an agreement with your assessment firm and they say, let's get this done in 45, that would be achievable. It could be achievable depending on if availability was there on both sides. So let's just say you're done with all that. The assessment firm has done all of their validation work and they've completed the necessary steps within the MyCSF tool. Then that all gets packaged up and sent to HITRUST for evaluation. So there is about a 28-day period. Now, I put that in there because I'm really working within that 90-day time frame and thinking about the assessor really wrapping up. Now, in that case right there, that's 28 days of assessor time. So the reason why I show you kind of across the top who's responsible, because when you're planning resources on your side, you need to know, okay, it's going to take me 4.5 months to get through a certification assessment, but you don't necessarily have involvement in all of those steps. A lot of those, 10, 20 days of assessment time is something the assessor wraps up. So you're free to continue with your normal daily routine at that point. So that's why I kind of wanted to show you who's responsible across the top. So you can kind of estimate how much of a resource do I need on my side? How long is this going to take me? I would say, outside of that remediation phase, that 90 days of really like buckling down and making sure that all those gaps are remediated, the rest of it is pretty manageable to incorporate, with your other tasks. So anyway, we're submitting it. Now we're at with a second to the column on the right, second to the last column there on the right, where we're going through a quality assurance. Now, what's interesting about the HITRUST certification process is that as assessors, our work is then validated. So HITRUST goes through a quality review process. They allow up to 2 weeks. So what they do is they'll choose at random, controls, at least one from every one of the 19 assessment domains, and they're asking the assessor they're auditing the auditor. I mean, essentially, they're checking on our work. They're making sure that we validated the control. I think this is one of those things where I think this really adds a lot of strength to the program, because the assessors are on a level playing field. You can't go to one and get certification based on a relationship that you may have with an assessment firm. I mean, we are all tested. We're held to a high standard of quality on these and all the reports that we do. But in this particular case, HITRUST is they are the only ones that issue certification. Therefore, they are going to go through and check the work of the assessor. So there's 2 weeks in there for that process, and then HITRUST will not guarantee a report any sooner than 6 weeks. So there is a 6-week period where HITRUST is gathering all that information. They're compiling it. They are the ones writing the report. So there's nothing that the assessor firm can do to speed that process up. That is a window of time that we really don't have any control over. So all of that being said, all of that together, including the gap analysis, we're saying allow yourself up to 10 months. But for the assessment itself, if you've already gone through the gap analysis, we're saying about 4.5 months to complete the actual validated assessment and get that certification report in your hands. So I hope that gives you a clearer picture on timeline because I know this graphic is a little bit hard to follow, but if you understand that we're really just trying to define responsibility, give you what the task is, and then give you an example of how many days or what the timeline is to expect for that to occur. So we can go on to the next. All right. So then let's say, for example, you get through the validated assessment, you've got your certification report in hand. What does that mean? Where do you go next? Their certification is valid for 2 years. So for a 24-month period of time is how long certification lasts. But there is an interim review that you need to be aware of. And actually, HITRUST just released a statement earlier today that said that that interim review, the quality assessment, is actually going to start being performed within the CSF tool. I'm sure there'll be more information coming out, but as of right now, it's performed outside of the tool. It is unlocked for the assessor during that period of time, but that's going to be something that we're going to see moving towards, being able to function through the CSF tool to perform this interim review. So anyway, not to complicate the issue, but to understand this, every other year, there will be some sort of connection with your assessor. Every 2 years, you will go through the full assessment, and then every other year in between, you'll go through what's called an interim review. So again, that's kind of like the quality review, where there'll be areas that we'll have to retest within each of those 19 assessment domains. We will check on the status of the CAPs, of the corrective action plan, really wanting to see that there's been activity and there's been work towards remediation. So all of those things are going to be looked at during that interim review, because there is a process that you need to be aware of called decertification. So if for some reason during that interim review you do not pass the expectations, HITRUST does have the ability to take that certification from you, that certification status from you. So you really need to be thinking of this as a continuous improvement cycle, which is really what the maturity model is all about. It's about putting controls in place, making sure that they're implemented, and making sure that you're continuing to improve. And speaking of continuing improvement, version 9 of the CSF is set to come out anytime. I know they released a press release in July that said mid-August we would see version 9 coming out. And there are significant changes. There's the changes, really most notable is that the 66 controls required for certification is now bumping up to 75. So you'll be scored on the maturity model scoring that we just talked through on 75 of those controls. And that's set to be released any day now. I've been kind of watching and waiting and trying to find out when it's going to be released. So there is a reason to have in place a continuous improvement cycle. And it's one of the other benefits, in my opinion, of adopting the Common Security Framework for your organization, because HITRUST is out there looking at breach activity. They're looking at, federal government regulatory fines and fees, and they're looking at things that they can incorporate into the CSF to make our systems stronger, to create a better defense mechanism. So the idea of continuing to improve really has to be there to really fully adopt this framework, because like I said, the fear here is spending all this time and money on getting certification and then having something happen and taken away. So I do have a question in the chat box about, are there costs for the CSF review? Oh, I think, are you talking about maybe the interim review? So the interim review, HITRUST as of right now does not charge you for that, but the assessment firm will, of course, because it's a matter of time investment of revalidating up to 19 controls. So the cost to consider, it's a fraction of the every other year cost for certification, but there is a cost associated with the interim review. All right, so speaking of, I really just covered a lot of this in the previous slide, so I'm kind of going to go, the CSF cost. Now the CSF itself, the Common Security Framework, is free to download on their website. So if you're a qualifying organization, basically that means that you're not an audit firm, or you're not doing consulting, you're not going to use the CSF for any other benefit other than your own controls. You can go to the HITRUST Alliance website and download the CSF for free. Now, it's a lengthy, lengthy document. I showed you just a fragment of one control today, but it's really filled with a lot of great, useful information. It is free to download as long as you're going to use it for yourself and not to make money consulting with others. All right, so back to this, the interim review, like I talked about already in quite length. We're looking for any changes or updates that have happened, with the controls that must be tested, and we're going to review the corrective action plan, which is very critical in this particular case. So we can go ahead and go on to the next. All right, so again, more information about the corrective action plan themselves. So when you're navigating the MyCSF tool, and like I said before, if you're not meeting that 3+ on the maturity model scale, you're not meeting that scoring requirement, and quite frankly, it would have to be pretty close. So you're missing maybe 1 or 2 things. You're not quite there, so you're going to enter a corrective action plan. So these are the criteria that have to be included in the corrective action plan. So the gap identifier or the control identifier, the HITRUST CSF mapping, the point of contact, the scheduled completion date, the corrective action that you've already taken, how it was identified, the date, and the status. So these just give you an idea. Obviously, it's your plan. You're going to be the one managing to this. So you can add to this, obviously however you want to track this. But this is the recommendation, the requirement that HITRUST has put in place for managing the corrective action plan. So you can go on to the next. All right. My favorite slide, how can Kirkpatrick Price assist you with your HITRUST CSF requirements? Well, I hope that you understand by listening in today and realizing how passionate we are about, really trying to help you through this process. We realize how important it is for you to comply, whether it's to maintain business relationships, whether it's to grow your business, whatever the case may be. We see the need. Obviously, we're very passionate about information security, and we can help you in a multitude of ways. So free education like today is one way we can help you. Other ways, obviously, the audits that we perform that are in this area, the SOC 2, really popular lately is clients of ours that are already receiving a SOC 2, and they have the 3 trust services principles, security, availability, and confidentiality. They have those 3 trust services principles. They're receiving a SOC 2 Type 2. There is a way for us to incorporate the HITRUST CSF to TSP mapping within Section 5 of their SOC 2 report. It's a really, really great due diligence level to show clients and prospective clients, hey, I've been receiving a SOC 2 maybe for a year or 2, and this is how the trust services principles that were already implemented relate to the HITRUST CSF. So if you're hearing talk about HITRUST and you're receiving a SOC 2 annually today, that's definitely something that you want to discuss with your audit firm or discuss with us if we're your audit firm. We want to be your audit firm, and these are things that we've done to really kind of help our clients get the first step forward in achieving HITRUST certification. So starting with the SOC 2, the SOC 2 Plus that I talked about earlier, that's when the trust services principles are replaced with the HITRUST CSF, and we're actually formulating an opinion on your compliance. We're attesting to your compliance with the CSF. And then, of course, you can combine the two. The largest, assessment meeting all of the criteria would be having your SOC 2 Plus and then having HITRUST certification appended to that. I'm not seeing a ton of activity in that area because it seems like it's not necessarily being asked for, it's not necessarily being required, but it is an option if you want to go that route. So, of course, we can do the CSF validated assessment, hopefully leading to certification because we are an approved assessment firm. We can assist you with a self-assessment, and then, of course, general guidance and consulting. We can help you with your portal, MyCSF portal assistance, scoping, a guided risk analysis. We're doing a lot of risk assessment and risk analysis work. Lately, companies really seeing the value of that, and of course, with all of the OCR and the HIPAA Phase 2 activity, really understanding that risk analysis is a strong need for companies today. And of course, policy and procedure drafting. A lot of people may not know that we actually have a team of professional writers that do a fantastic job of gathering information from you about your controls and actually developing those policies and procedures. So these are all the ways that we are helping people today working towards HITRUST certification. And this is a wonderful little graphic I just put together when we were first having discussions with people about, what do I need? And the first question I ask when someone calls and says they're interested in HITRUST, the very first question I ask is certification required? Because a lot of times if you received a letter from your client, if you're responding to an RFP, if you are, whatever the case may be, asking your client, is certification required? Is it, because compliance and certification can be somewhat misunderstood and interchanged. And the first question you should ask, is certification required? Because if it is, it takes you obviously down another route to where HITRUST must be involved and certification must be granted by HITRUST, et cetera. So hopefully this just kind of graphically gives you a way of navigating, what do I need? What report do I need? What audit do I need? What services do I need? So we can go on to the next, and there we go. I guess that's it. There's my information on the screen there, my phone number, my email address. As you can tell, people tell me all the time I'm very passionate about this HITRUST, and I absolutely am. I'm really wanting to help you answer any questions that you possibly can. If I don't know the answer, I obviously will help you find that out. So please contact me if you have any questions. And I think that concludes our 3 series. And I know we have the videos, the HITRUST videos that you should be looking for too. I don't know if, I think some of those are actually on our website in the blog area if you're interested in the actual videos. So thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Jenna.
Yeah, look in your emails tomorrow. We'll have links to those videos as well as the previous webinar recordings. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Jesse, for all this great info on HITRUST. It is a confusing topic, so I'm glad that we have an expert to guide the way. So I just have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for joining.